College football nerds here talking Tennessee and Kentucky. Tennessee fans, Josh, have showed up to let us know that we picked the Tennessee-Alabama game wrong, and that's okay. We are here for y'all to tell us that in the comments. We're happy to eat crow on that one. It was a close game, but I think that Tennessee has proven to this point that they are a monster, and they are at home again, and they're particularly monstery at home, Josh. Vegas has got this one a little tighter than maybe people would think based on the rankings and who these teams are to this point in the season. But, Josh, and we're going to be a little more conversational about this one because I think that these are kind of fun to do it this way. But I think that Vegas, and maybe tip in our hand, our model is picking up on a little bit that maybe Kentucky's a little better than people want to give them credit. They're a good defensive team. Levis is a good quarterback. But in general, Josh, I wonder how many people are overselling the Kentucky loss, not realizing what Levis means to this team. The South Carolina loss, not realizing what Levis means to this team. And maybe they're more the Mississippi State result than they are the South Carolina or Ole Miss result.
Right. So Levis got hurt a couple weeks ago. They lose the South Carolina game 14-24. Really had no offense in that game. But when Levis has been healthy, the passing game, even without a ton of volume, has moved the ball pretty darn well for Kentucky. He's been 10 yards per attempt against Mississippi State, 9.2 against Ole Miss, about 12 against Northern Illinois. Youngstown State, he was about 11. Florida game was really his worst game of the year. They won that game 26-16. He still threw for over 200 yards. They have the ability to throw the ball pretty well. I think they're limited a little bit at the wide receiver position. But I think Will Levis gives them the ability to move the football well. And that's the starting point of this conversation, because if you can throw the ball well, and I'll go ahead and throw a number out, Tennessee's pass defense is giving 100% of opponent averages. Even in that Alabama game where they got up on them 28-10, that Tennessee pass defense gave up a ton of yards. UT Martin, they couldn't shut them down for 4 quarters, and that was an FCS team. I think if you can throw the ball against Tennessee, you can score some. And Kentucky offensively, I think, is viewed a little bit wrong due to those couple losses, and injuries to Levis were a big part of that. And without those injuries, I think, I don't think they lose to South Carolina if he's healthy and able to play through that whole game. And we view this game very differently if this was a 6-1 Kentucky coming into the game versus the current 5-2 with those 2 losses. But really, that loss without Levis shouldn't inform how we view Kentucky, because it's not who they are. And so from a projection standpoint, and our model kind of views it this way, this is really more like a 6-1 Kentucky team with a reasonably good passing offense, and that gives them something of a puncher's chance.
Yeah, and you noted on his game against Mississippi State, 10 yards per attempt, Bryce Young was 7.1 last week against Mississippi State. And, there might be some issues there with coming up on a bye, super tired, he's got the shoulder thing, but still, 7.1 is 7.1. And they confused him a lot more than they confused Levis. Last year, Levis went off on Tennessee. 42 points. They lost that game 45-42, which is interesting and maybe worth noting as we get into this, in that Kentucky has had a great defense for a long time, but Tennessee still managed 45 points on them, which is noteworthy because Georgia did not. I think that was 30-13 kind of game. But Josh, if we're talking about Kentucky having to play Georgia, having to play Tennessee, is this maybe the game that they're going to have more of a puncher's chance because of matchups? Matchups are important in that Kentucky needs to play teams that don't have really good defenses, because they hit some stall points with the way their offense operates, in that they can't score against good defenses. They just can't. Tennessee, who has struggled defensively, even though they're an elite offense and can score a bunch of points, from a matchup standpoint, doesn't it feel like this is the game that Kentucky could snap up and beat somebody versus maybe a Georgia or even an Alabama?
I think so. And if you look at Kentucky statistically, again, going sort of previewing the model numbers there, 88% of opponent rushing averages, 88% of opponent passing averages. That run numbers, people get pretty low. 88% is pretty average. I would say that's average to maybe slightly above average. 88% against the pass is a little more respectable. It's harder to stop teams from throwing the football. And that's the thing with Kentucky in terms of a defense is they're just kind of competent. So what they need to be able to do is to play a team where they can actually put up points. And the only way they're going to really be able to put up points is if the other defense is bad enough for them to get something going. I mean, 3 of the top 4 pass catchers for Kentucky right now are freshmen. And that says a lot about what they're at from a talent and skill position perspective. And we talk about freeze points and, stall points, break points, things like that. I mean, the idea with football is you got to have enough production to move the chains to get going. And once you get to that point, you can sustain drives and do some good things. And if you can cross another threshold, you explode. On the Kentucky side of the ball there, offensively, they've struggled to hit 6.5 yards per play. I mean, Northern Illinois was 6.6. Miami of Ohio was 6.1. Mississippi State, in that October 15th game, was actually kind of interesting to me because it was 6.55 yards per play, which was on up there with even the really kind of trash competition they played. I think it says a lot about where they'd advanced as an offense. And, I don't know that they're predicted to have that number, but the truth of the matter is if they can get some level of production, it doesn't take a ton. They can move the ball, they can score points, they can maybe get near 30 points in a game. And I'll turn this around a little bit and talk too, when you talk about break points, right? I think there's a perception right now that Tennessee can score 50 points on anybody, and I'm not sure that's totally realistic and fair. Against Alabama, they had 8.1 yards per attempt, or yards per play, much higher per attempt. It was like 12 point something per attempt. That is a crazy high number, and it's really inconsistent with the rest of their year. LSU was 6.5 yards per play. They scored 40 points. The Florida game, Tennessee went off from a yardage perspective, had 8.2 yards per play, even more than they did against Alabama. They only scored 38 points. And what I'm getting at here, like Pittsburgh, 5.4 yards per play, 34 points. That Alabama game is kind of an aberration, both on the scoring side and the yardage side. We haven't really seen them put up that kind of a number against a good defense or solid defense this year in terms of yardage. And from a scoring perspective, they scored a lot more points than they normally would with that kind of yardage. I mean, getting into the 50s is really high. And quite frankly, I think because of how vertical they are and how many shots they take, they have a tendency to leave yards on the field. I mean, with Alabama, they got over the top and they hit a touchdown. If you hit a touchdown, all your yards are points, right? And our model's not this simplistic, but I'm just saying this as a simplification. But in general, they'll get some big runs or something, and they throw over the top, and they miss or overthrow 2 plays in a row, and they punt, and so you can lose a lot of yardage that way. So, from Kentucky's perspective, they cross that freeze point. They get into the realm of a team that can operate. They get into a realm of a team that can move the chains a little bit. They can score a little bit of points. And from Tennessee's perspective, the question is, do they really hit that break point? Against Alabama, they did, but same deal. Everybody kept expecting Trevor Lawrence to be 2018 Clemson against Alabama. He never really was, ever again. And I think that game had a lot to do with the fact that sometimes Alabama just has complete meltdowns defensively. And it feels like this is a recurring theme under Saban. It happens sometimes they win those games, sometimes they don't. It's about a 50-50 shot. That might have just been an Alabama meltdown game. In which case, yeah, you win the game. You deserve credit for it. You deserve to be a top 4 team. We've both got you in that realm in our rankings. But from a projection standpoint, I'm not sure that's something you really can take forward. So I think both these teams, in my opinion, are probably kind of operating within that functional realm above your freeze point and, not completely explosive realm where they're below the break point where you're kind of in a normal score for both sides.
And I'll say, because Tennessee fans are going to come at you now, if they don't have that bonkers offensive performance but have just a really good one against Alabama, they still might win that game because Alabama reacted in a way, just like the Texas game for Alabama. Like, they reacted in a way that had them not scoring a ton of points because Texas wasn't scoring a lot of points. So the flip side is also true. There's probably another, linear universe that separates from this one where Alabama and Tennessee played, and Tennessee won that game 38-35. Right? So I don't completely want to discount that. I don't want to discount that win at all, but I also want to say that game had a certain rhythm to it. One thing that I think we're far enough into the season that it's a thing and it's not an aberration, because Tennessee has played a number of good teams at this point, is Tennessee's run defense. And we just spent a whole thing with Georgia saying we don't know who they are because they haven't played anybody except for Oregon, and that was weird. Ohio State hasn't played anybody. We don't really know who they are. We know that Tennessee has played the number 1 and number 2 run offenses in the country, in Alabama and Florida, and they held both of them well below their averages. And I think Alabama ran for like 3.7 yards per attempt, or maybe that was Gibbs, whatever the person was or the team was. That run defense is legit. And for a Kentucky team, especially with Rodriguez back, that really all the talk is about quarterback for them. But if they can't run the ball, that offense doesn't function. How much is, and maybe this gets you really into the model, how much is that Tennessee run defense that has established itself as a legitimate top 10 run defense something that could come into play?
Yeah, and so I will turn to the model right now because I think it's a good time to bring it up. I've already talked about a lot of the defensive statistics and stuff. The one number that I didn't talk about is that Tennessee rush defense. 66% of opponent averages running the ball. That is an elite number. It's not just very good. That's elite. If you're kind of 65% or below. And for comparison's sake, we did a Georgia model. Georgia's only at 80. Ohio State, 77%. Michigan right now is 77%. Tennessee is a tier better than Ohio State, Michigan, or Georgia in our metrics as a run defense. And I think it's really that Tennessee front on both sides of the ball that is winning them football games. The thing that really struck me when I watched that Alabama game, and I tweeted about it a little bit, Alabama could not deal with the run that Tennessee was putting forward. They're getting like 6 to 8 yards a carry when they really wanted to. And the problem was Alabama was trying to be light to deal with the pass because they got four guys wide most plays, 2x2 splits a ton with stack formations, at least on one side of the ball, if not both, or one side of the field or the other. But the problem is they would run for 6 or 7 yards on first down, and Alabama had to do something about that. So you have to commit some sort of numbers in the box. And they wanted to play 5 in the box, 6 against the pass. And that lets you have 2 on 2 on the receivers and a safety over the top, 6 defensive backs. Because of the run, Alabama couldn't do that. And so they had to keep a safety in the box, or they had to have an extra linebacker or lineman on the field. And that meant that you've got now 5 DBs covering 2 and 2. Well, you got 1 safety, so either the safety's over one side and ignoring the other, or he's in the middle of the field and he can't actually get to the sidelines, and they're wide split, so they're already at the sidelines. Plus, most teams aren't going to be in those formations with 5 defensive backs and only have 1 safety. So what would happen is Alabama would roll 1 safety on one side, and on the other side, there's 3 corners, the nickel, a corner, and a corner. On the other side, you've got a safety rolling down, and he's stuck in man coverage with a corner on 2 receivers. They get a release on a receiver. So everything they're doing is really predicated by their ability to run the ball and stop the run. If Alabama could have stopped their run, I think they would have played with 2 safeties over the top the whole time and been in man coverage. You would have never seen a single release from Hyatt. Now, I'll say Hyatt had 174 yards and 2 touchdowns against UT Martin in like the second quarter last week. I think he may just be a dude. And as much as everybody expects Cedric Tillman to come back and set the world on fire, I don't know. It may be that we're discovering that Hyatt is a Devontae Smith level guy or something where people just can't cover him. And he may well prove to be better than Tillman for some reason. Maybe just the sheer speed that he brings to the table combined with that scheme. But everything is predicated by their ability to win the line of scrimmage. And yeah, I mean, that plays out both sides of the model. Here you see the fact that Kentucky is a run-based team, but they're actually not that great. Their current average running the ball is only about 3.1 yards per carry. A lot of that, again, is due to some injuries at the running back position and other factors. But they're a team that mostly runs the ball, and they don't do it particularly well, and Tennessee can stop the run. That holds Kentucky to only about 5 yards per play. But the other side of the ball is Kentucky does have a reasonably good defense. And Tennessee's offense, which has bonkers numbers, 4.7 yards per carry, 11 yards per attempt, they get held to a down-to-earth 6.5 yard per play number. That is the same kind of realm that they existed against LSU, the same kind of realm they existed in that, like, you know, a little more than they had against Pittsburgh. And the projection there is 28 points. The problem for the model is there's a lot of things that it's having to sort of sort through, right? The Florida game, 38 points with 8.2 yards per play. LSU was a similar number. They scored 40. How do you sort of put that all together? I think the model is probably being a little conservative there for Tennessee, but I also think it's probably being too conservative for Kentucky. 28-17 is an 11-point margin. I will say the point spread, I looked it up a minute ago, was at 13. So this is kind of tracking with Vegas. The difference is the over-under is about 63. So this only has it 42 points. I personally think both these numbers are about 10 points too low from a modeling perspective. I think it's probably more realistically something like 27-38. And I will note, we talked about when we were doing the Alabama model and some people kind of got upset about it, but I did some tweaking to the model because Tennessee didn't have a low yardage, low scoring point. And I didn't do anything to affect Tennessee's production or anything to change the way that the model is predicting yardage. But I did some things to try to force the model to know, okay, if you don't have any yards and you don't score any points, what does that picture look like? And if you go bonkers and have 15 yards per play, what is the scoring ceiling for a football team? And our model is sort of it's a sort of a self-learning concept with how it comes up with scores. And the scoring model is unique to each team. It's not just points per play. It's more complicated than that. But it's actually developed unique for each team, depending on different teams need different things to be successful. Certain aspects matter more for each team. It kind of weights it unique to each team. And for every team and every model this week, I took those concepts I did for Tennessee and I refined it and reapplied it. So it does apply here for Tennessee, and it may be holding the scoring lower in the model than it should have. It's something I'm going to kind of have to keep playing with. But I've seen way too many scores this year, had way too high margins or high scoring potential. And I think our model's been a little out of whack. So I'm just kind of trying to refine it a little bit. And I think you're seeing more reasonable numbers in our model. But this one I think is surprising because it's particularly low compared to what you would expect from Tennessee.
I'm ready to give a score on this one. I think Kentucky is better than they're being given credit. I think that the South Carolina game, they win that game probably by 2 touchdowns with Levis in. It just broke the whole thing. South Carolina doesn't score 24 points if they're not holding Kentucky to 14. There's a lot of that at play. In my opinion, I do think that Tennessee's run game or run defense is noteworthy in this game. But I also think that Kentucky's going to score some points. It's at home. I've got Tennessee by 10, 37-27, so not quite covering. But I've got Tennessee third right now in my top 10. Tennessee can win this game by 3 points, and I'll still have them third in my top 10 probably, because I think that a win over this Kentucky team this year is a good win. I don't think Kentucky is elite by any means. I don't think they're a top 10 team, but I think they're a good team. And like you said with Georgia, we're not out here judging teams only by their worst game. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if this is a little tighter than maybe even Vegas thinks. But either way, I think that if Tennessee gets out alive, I think it'll be considered a good win.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the same realm. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. I think that this model is a little too low scoring. Vegas seems to think it as well. I'm going to say this game is 42-28. Like you, I've got Tennessee number 4, only behind Michigan, Georgia, and Ohio State. I think they're a very good team. If they win this game by 2 points, it's not going to faze me. I think Kentucky. People view Kentucky based on their record, but that's not, again, record and quality are two separate things. And if you have a team that loses their starting quarterback, they can lose to a lot of people. And that doesn't make them a bad football team. And just because they lost to some teams when they had a bad quarterback or their starting running back Rodriguez gets out hurt, that doesn't mean that when those guys come back and they're relatively healthy, that it isn't tough to beat them and it isn't a big deal to beat them. And I think that's kind of the situation Tennessee's in. And they got that big game with Georgia looming on the horizon too. They just came out of a huge win against Alabama, and I know there's a game in the middle there. But this is kind of a trap game for Tennessee against a team that I think is a lot more dangerous than people want to give them credit for. It's been true for years with Kentucky. Usually at some point in the season, Kentucky's depth gives out. It could be this game. And I will be curious to see if Tennessee's offense really is clicking at the level where it's just going to put up 40-plus every week. Because we've seen that. We've seen that from Ohio State. We've seen that from Alabama in recent years. But we haven't the last couple. And I think defenses have caught on enough to where if they're not doing something stupid, they can hold you under 40. And I think this is going to be kind of that game where Tennessee's going to have to work a little more than they think they will. And they're going to get points. I think they're going to win. But you combine that with the fact that defensively Tennessee's not great and that Kentucky has a quarterback that can play pretty darn well. I think this ends up being a fairly competitive game that Tennessee wins comfortably but doesn't cover. That would be my prediction.
All right, y'all, that's it for this game, Kentucky and Tennessee. Give us your score prediction in the comments. Let us know what you think, and we'll mix it up with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.